A royal misstep. Queen Camilla confronts a guard. The aftermath resonates deeply. Emotional narrative, Part 1. The morning air over Buckingham Palace was crisp and grey, the kind of quiet that settles over London before the city fully wakes up. The long stone corridors inside the palace hummed with the low sounds of footsteps and distant preparation. Courtiers moved carefully, staff whispered in hushed tones, and the guards stood at their posts with their usual stillness, faces like stone, eyes forward, trained to show nothing. It was a world bound by tradition, by unspoken rules that had been passed down for generations, and everyone inside those walls understood their role without being told twice. Queen Camilla had been part of this world long enough to know its rhythms. She had walked these halls as a guest, as a companion, and eventually as a queen consort. She understood the expectations, the protocols, the careful dance of royal life. But that morning, something small happened, something that, from the outside, might have looked like nothing at all. Yet the weight of it would linger in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it, and eventually reach far beyond the palace walls. It began near the East Wing, in a corridor lined with old portraits and polished floors that caught the morning light. Queen Camilla was walking with a small group of staff, heading toward a meeting. She moved at a steady pace, dressed simply for the morning hour, her expression composed but warm. She had always been known among the palace staff as approachable, someone who noticed people, remembered names, asked after families. It was one of the things that had slowly won over a public that had once been cold toward her. There was a young guard standing at the far end of the corridor. He was new, not many weeks into his posting. His name was Thomas, though few outside his regiment knew it. He stood straight as a board, shoulders squared, chin lifted. He had practiced this posture until it became second nature. He was proud to be there. He had grown up wanting this, had trained hard for it, and every morning when he took his position, he felt the quiet dignity of doing something that mattered. That morning, however, something went wrong. As Queen Camilla's group approached, Thomas shifted his weight to come to full attention. It was the right thing to do, but in that small, careful movement, his ceremonial staff struck the wall with a dull, echoing knock. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but in the silence of that long corridor it rang out like a gong. Every head turned. Thomas froze, his face going pale beneath his composed exterior. His eyes did not move, he had been trained not to let them, but his jaw tightened. Queen Camilla paused. The staff around her paused too, uncertain, reading her face for cues. This was the moment that would define what came next. In royal settings, even the smallest disruption carries meaning. A guard losing composure, even slightly, could be noted, reported, and followed up with consequences that might seem disproportionate to the moment. Everyone in that corridor knew it. Thomas knew it most of all. What the Queen did next surprised them. She did not walk past without acknowledgement. She did not offer the cool, distant expression that protocol might have allowed. Instead, she stopped. She turned slightly toward the young guard and looked at him, not with irritation, not with the stiff formality of someone asserting rank, but with something far more human. Her eyes were steady and calm. There was a pause, the kind that feels much longer than it is, where the air itself seems to hold still. Then she spoke. Her words were quiet, meant only for that corridor, not for any cameras or reporters or public record. What she said in that moment reached Thomas in a way that no formal acknowledgement ever could. She did not dismiss the moment. She did not ignore it and move on as though he were invisible. She acknowledged him, not the mistake, not the sound, but him, as a person standing in a difficult position, trying his best in a world that demanded perfection. The group moved on. The corridor returned to its usual quiet, but Thomas remained at his post with something changed in his chest, a warmth that had not been there before, and a weight that had also lifted. He had prepared himself for a different kind of consequence. Instead, he had been seen. And for a young man standing far from home, doing a job that asked him to be invisible, that single moment of being seen by the Queen of England would stay with him far longer than he ever expected. No one recorded what was said. No one wrote it down in any official report. But palace staff talk, as they always have, in quiet rooms and over shared meals, and in the long pauses between duties. The story of what happened in that corridor began to move through the palace like soft wind, not as gossip, but as something worth remembering. Something had happened that morning that reminded everyone within those stone walls that even the most powerful people carry with them the choice of how to treat those who stand below them. And Queen Camilla, in one unremarkable hallway moment, had made a choice that no one who was there would easily forget. By the afternoon of that same day, the quiet story had already passed through several pairs of hands. A senior footman mentioned it to a housekeeper. The housekeeper repeated it to one of the Queen's personal attendants. It was not shared with any ill intent. There was no jealousy in the telling, no sharpness. It was shared the way people share things that genuinely move them, the way a small act of kindness passes from one person to the next because it deserves to be carried further. Thomas returned to his barracks that evening carrying the memory of it like something fragile. He was a reserved young man by nature, not cold, but careful with his words. He had learned early that in environments built on discipline and rank, it was wiser to listen than to speak. He had 3 brothers back home in a small town in the north of England, and he had been the one who left, who pushed himself, who wanted something bigger than what the town could offer. His mother had cried when he left, not from unhappiness, but from the particular pride that mothers carry when their children exceed what they imagined for them. He sat in the barracks that night and wrote her a letter. He still wrote letters, handwritten ones, because his mother kept them in a wooden box on her kitchen shelf and said she liked being able to hold his words. He did not always know what to fill the letters with. Days on duty were quiet and largely the same, the kind of repetition that was hard to make interesting to read. But that evening, he had something to say. He wrote about the morning. He wrote about the moment when the staff hit the wall. He wrote about how his stomach had dropped and how he had braced himself. And then he wrote about what the Queen had done and how it had felt and why it had stayed with him all day. He did not write it dramatically. He was not a dramatic person. He wrote it the way he spoke, plainly, with care, getting the facts right before anything else. But somewhere in the middle of the letter, his pen slowed and he wrote something that surprised even himself as he wrote it. He wrote that he had not realized until that moment how much it mattered to be seen. Not praised, not rewarded, just seen. Acknowledged as a person rather than a fixture. He sat with that sentence for a while before he folded the letter and sealed the envelope. Back in the palace, Queen Camilla's day had moved on as they always did: meetings and correspondence and the careful management of public duties. She had not thought much more about the corridor encounter. It had not been a dramatic thing in her mind. She had simply done what came naturally to her in that moment. She had never been someone who enjoyed coldness, even when coldness was available as an option. Even in the years when she had been treated with public hostility, and there had been many such years, she had learned to meet people where they were rather than where she wished they would be. Those years had shaped her in ways that were sometimes difficult to articulate. She had stood in the shadow of enormous grief, enormous scrutiny, enormous public judgment. She had been the woman people blamed, the name that was said with contempt at dinner tables across Britain and beyond. She had carried that, year after year, with a kind of quiet endurance that did not announce itself but simply persisted. And in persisting, she had found something, a deep understanding of what it felt like to be dismissed, reduced, unseen. It had not made her bitter. It had made her perceptive. And her perception in that corridor that morning had reached a young guard in a way that no one had planned. What no one inside the palace could have anticipated was that the story would not stay inside. Somewhere in the chain of quiet telling, it reached someone with a wider audience. A retired staff member who still kept close friendships within the palace heard the account over tea. She mentioned it in passing to her daughter, who mentioned it online in a forum where royal watchers gathered to discuss what the people inside the palace were really like. The post was brief and undramatic, just as the original event had been, but something about it captured people. It was not long before the story began to circulate in a wider way. Royal news is consumed eagerly in Britain and in many corners of the world, and stories that reveal the private character of public figures, not through scandal, but through simple humanity, tend to travel far. This one was no different. Within 2 days, several publications had picked it up, though few had more than fragments of what had actually happened. What they printed was incomplete, a version of the truth shaped by the gaps in what anyone outside the palace truly knew. But even in its incomplete form, the story moved people. Comments gathered beneath the articles, threads expanded across social platforms, and people who had spent years carrying complicated feelings about Camilla found themselves pausing. They were not erasing history. They were not rewriting what they believed. But they were stopping briefly to hold something new alongside the old, a small moment in a corridor, a young guard who had been seen, and a queen who had chosen in a quiet instant to simply be human. The full meaning of that choice, however, had not yet fully revealed itself. Something was still unfolding, something that would reach further than the palace walls and land in a place no one inside had expected. Thomas's mother received the letter 3 days after he wrote it. She recognized his handwriting on the envelope before she even opened it, that careful, slightly cramped script he had always had, the letters leaning just a little to the right as though they were in a hurry and trying to hold themselves back. She opened it at the kitchen table, which was where she opened all of his letters, with a cup of tea in front of her and the wooden box nearby, waiting. She read it slowly, the way she always did, not rushing through to see what had happened, but savoring each line the way one savors a meal after waiting a long time for it. By the time she reached the part about the corridor, she had stopped sipping her tea. By the time she read the sentence about being seen, her eyes had gone still and quiet in the way eyes go when something touches a very deep place. She sat with the letter for a long time after she finished it. Then she did something she had never done with any of his letters before. She called her neighbor Margaret, an older woman who had lived on the same street for 40 years and who had known Thomas since he was small enough to ride his bicycle into her fence. She asked Margaret to come over, and when Margaret arrived, she read the letter aloud. Margaret sat across the table and listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Margaret, who was not a quiet woman by nature. When the reading was finished, Margaret sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said that what the Queen had done sounded like something a good person would do, not a royal person, not a famous person, but simply a good one. And those words, simply a good one, stayed in the kitchen long after Margaret had gone home. Meanwhile, the media coverage of the story had grown louder. What had begun as a few lines on a royal discussion forum had expanded into full articles, then opinion pieces, then television mentions. Reporters who covered the royal family tried to get more details. Palace representatives declined to comment, as they almost always do on private internal matters. This silence, predictably, made people more curious rather than less. Speculation filled the space where facts were absent. Some versions of the story were accurate in spirit but loose with the details. Others invented emotions and words that no one present had actually reported. Thomas was aware of none of it. His world inside the palace walls was deliberately separated from the noise of the outside. Phones were restricted during duty hours. He had not seen any of the coverage. He was simply going about his work, carrying his own quiet memory of the morning, not knowing that it had traveled so far beyond him. It was another guard who told him, a senior colleague named Daniel, who had been posted at the palace for 6 years, and who had seen enough to know that these things sometimes happened. He found Thomas during a break and told him carefully that a version of the story was circulating in the press. He said it calmly, without judgment, and watched Thomas's face closely to see how he would take it. Thomas went still, not with shock exactly, but with a kind of careful attention, the way a person goes still when they are trying to understand something before they react to it. He asked what was being said. Daniel told him the basic shape of it, the corridor, the staff, the Queen's response. Thomas nodded slowly. He asked if his name had been used. Daniel said no, not in any version he had seen. Thomas nodded again and looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then he said something that Daniel would later remember. He said that he hoped the story being told outside was the real one, because the real one was worth telling. He was not speaking with vanity. He was not pleased at the attention. He was speaking about the Queen, about what she had actually done, about the fact that a moment of genuine humanity deserved to be accurately represented and not distorted into something smaller or more sensational. He did not want it turned into a celebrity item. He did not want it turned into a point-scoring piece about royal character versus royal reputation. He wanted the real thing to survive the distance it had traveled. Daniel looked at him for a moment and said that was a wise thing to say. Thomas shrugged the way young men shrug when they do not know how to accept a compliment. But the words had come from somewhere real inside him, from the part of him that had written to his mother about being seen, from the part that understood, in some instinctive way, that the truth of a moment is always more fragile than the story that surrounds it. Back at the palace, someone had finally brought the coverage to the attention of those closer to the Queen. Not to create alarm, but simply because it was there and growing, and those responsible for managing the royal family's public image needed to be aware. The response was measured, as it always was: no confirmation, no denial, a quiet monitoring. But among those who passed the information along, there was something else underneath the professional management of it, something personal and unspoken. Pride, perhaps, in a quiet and complicated way. Not in the coverage, but in the woman who had caused it simply by doing what was right. There is a particular kind of public conversation that takes place around royal figures, and it rarely makes room for complexity. People tend to have already made up their minds long before the story arrives, and the story gets sorted quickly into whatever drawer already exists: those who are ready to applaud, and those who are ready to dismiss. The corridor story was no different in that way. But what was unusual about it was the number of people who found themselves without a drawer, who sat with it uncomfortably, and could not decide what to do. Some of these were people who had carried a long-held image of Camilla as an intruder, a disruptor, someone who had arrived in the wrong story and refused to leave. For them, this new story did not erase what came before. But it did something awkward. It created a crack in a very settled thing. A crack does not demolish a wall, but it changes the wall, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. A woman named Priya, who lived in Birmingham and who had grown up in a household where Princess Diana was spoken of with a devotion that bordered on sacred, read the article about the corridor over her lunch break. She had not expected to feel anything other than mild irritation at another piece about Camilla. She read it quickly, the way one reads things one does not particularly want to read but cannot help reading. Then she read it again, more slowly. She did not change her mind about anything, but she noticed with some surprise that she was not unmoved. There was a young man in the story who had made a small mistake and had been treated with kindness. That part of it had nothing to do with dynasties or divorces or the long, complicated history of a family. It was just two people in a corridor, one of them choosing not to be unkind. She mentioned it to her colleague at the end of the workday, not as a statement of changed opinion, but simply as a strange thing she had noticed, that she had expected to feel nothing and had instead felt something. Her colleague, a man named Gary who had opinions about everything and regularly shared them, was quiet for a moment longer than usual before he said that was probably the point of stories like that. Not to change minds suddenly, but to add something small and true. Priya thought about that on the drive home and could not decide whether she found it comforting or unsettling. Back in the north of England, Thomas's mother had noticed the coverage too, not from seeking it out, but because one of her friends had seen it and sent her a message. The friend did not know the letter existed. She did not know Thomas was the guard in question. She sent the link the way people send things they find interesting, without any particular agenda. His mother read it and sat quietly for a long time. Then she went to the wooden box on the kitchen shelf and took out the most recent letter. She did not need to read it again. She had it practically memorized by that point. but she held it in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the texture of the paper. She thought about Thomas as a small boy, as a teenager, as the young man who had left their town with a backpack and a stubborn, quiet determination she had always privately loved. She thought about all the mornings he had stood at his post in a world that did not know his name, asking nothing of the people who walked past, except that they simply let him do his job. She thought about the sentence in his letter, that he had not realized how much it mattered to be seen. And she felt the particular ache that parents feel when they understand that their child has been carrying something alone. She wrote him back that evening. Her letters were longer than his. She had always been more comfortable with words on paper than in person. She told him she had seen the coverage. She told him she did not know whether he was the guard being written about, and that she did not need to know. She told him that whatever had happened, she thought he was the kind of person who would have deserved that kindness, and that she hoped he knew that. Then she filled the rest of the letter with ordinary things, news of his brothers, something funny that had happened at the market, a recipe she had been trying. She sealed it and set it beside the wooden box to post in the morning. Inside the palace, the days moved forward in their usual way. The coverage of the corridor story had peaked and was beginning to recede, as coverage always does when new things arrive to replace it. But within the palace walls, the story had embedded itself in a different way. Staff who had been there that morning spoke of it more openly now that it was being discussed outside. There was something freeing about that. The acknowledgement from the outside world that the moment had been worth noting seemed to give those who had witnessed it permission to say clearly that they had been moved by it too. One of the senior aides mentioned to a colleague that she had never seen anything quite like it in her years of service. Not because the Queen had been unusually kind, she often was, but because of the timing, the precision of the response, the way it had landed exactly as it needed to. There was something almost instinctive about it, the aide said, the kind of human response that cannot be rehearsed or advised into existence. It came from the inside. Her colleague nodded and said that was the thing that would stay, not just for the people who were there, but for the story that had escaped into the world. You could feel when something was real. And people, no matter how complicated their feelings about the person who had done the real thing, could feel that too. Weeks passed after the corridor story had faded from the headlines, and yet it had not entirely disappeared. It lived in quieter places now, in a wooden box on a kitchen shelf in northern England, in the memory of a senior aide who occasionally thought about it during the long formal evenings that palace life required, in the chest of a young guard who had added a new understanding to the list of things he carried with him. Stories that are real tend to do that. They stop being loud and begin being present instead. Thomas had received his mother's letter and read it alone in the early morning before his shift. She had not pressed him for details or asked whether he was the guard from the news. She had simply written what she knew of him, and that had been enough, more than enough. He folded the letter and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, the one closest to where his heart was, which he knew was sentimental but did not much care. He had learned from his mother that some sentimentality was not weakness, but simply honesty about what mattered. He thought about the Queen sometimes during his shifts, when the corridors were quiet, and his mind was allowed to drift slightly while his body stayed alert. He thought about what it must cost to be her, not in the obvious ways, the ceremonies and the constant scrutiny, but in the subtler ways. The cost of being perpetually watched. The cost of carrying decades of complicated public opinion while continuing to move through rooms and hallways and public events with composure. He was 23 years old, and he already found it hard to feel seen in the right way. He could not imagine what it would take to bear being seen in every wrong way for most of one's life, and still emerge capable of seeing others with such simple accuracy. He did not arrive at admiration easily. He had been raised in a family that was skeptical of deference, that had a healthy distrust of inherited power and the people who held it. But he had also been raised to call things what they were. And what the Queen had done that morning was a good thing. A clean, simple, uncomplicated good thing. He had called it that in his letter, and he called it that now in his thoughts, and the simplicity of it was part of what made it stay. Across the country, Priya in Birmingham had not stopped thinking about the story either, though it surprised her each time it surfaced. She found herself mentioning it in unexpected contexts, in a conversation with her mother, in an offhand comment at a dinner party, in a message to an old friend she hadn't spoken to in months. Each time, she framed it slightly differently as she tried to understand what it was exactly that she kept returning to. It was not that the story had changed her opinion. It was that it had disrupted the certainty of her opinion, introduced a small vibration into something that had been entirely settled. She found that she respected the disruption even as it made her slightly uncomfortable. Comfortable certainties are easier to live with than honest complications, but they are less true. Her friend responded to the message with something that Priya saved. The friend wrote that there is always more to a person than the role they have been given, and the roles we give people, whether we love them or resent them, tend to flatten something that was never flat. The corridor story, the friend wrote, was interesting not because it made Camilla a hero, but because it made her a person. And people are always more complicated and more capable of goodness than the roles that have been assigned to them. Priya read this 3 times. Then she went and found the wooden box her own mother kept, not of letters, but of photographs, and sat with it for a while for no reason she could clearly explain. Queen Camilla, meanwhile, had moved through the weeks as she always did, the world not pausing for her private moments any more than it paused for anyone else's. She had attended engagements, reviewed correspondence, sat through meetings that stretched long into the afternoons. She had been in corridors dozens of times since that morning, and guards had stood at their posts, and nothing remarkable had occurred. Life had resumed its ordinary shape. But one afternoon, as she was passing through the East Wing with a smaller group than usual, she happened to pass Thomas at his post. He stood straight, as he always did, face composed, eyes forward. She passed him as she always passed guards, but in the second before she moved fully past, something in her expression changed almost imperceptibly, the slight softening that happens when a face encounters something it recognizes. Not a smile, not an acknowledgement that would draw attention or put him in an awkward position, just that small shift. The way a person's face moves when they see someone they remember. Thomas kept his eyes forward. He did not move a muscle, but he felt it, that small shift, the way you feel warmth coming through a window even when you are not looking at the sun. He felt it and held it quietly, not letting it change his posture or his expression, because he was professional and because that was what the moment asked of him. But he held it. Later that evening, he sat down to write another letter home. He had not planned to write so soon after the last one, but something needed to be placed on paper, needed to be made real in the way that writing makes things real. He told his mother that something small had happened again today, that he still could not explain it fully. That he was beginning to think some moments were not meant to be explained, but simply kept, carried quietly, taken out occasionally, examined with care, then folded back and placed somewhere safe. He wrote that he thought this was what people meant when they spoke about dignity, not the dignity of rank or title or ceremony, the other kind, the kind that asks nothing of the person it is given to, requires no record and no audience, and leaves something behind in the quiet space where it was offered. He wrote that he was grateful for it, that he understood it better now than he had a few weeks ago, and that he thought understanding it better had made him, in some small way, better at his job, and perhaps better at other things too. He sealed the envelope. He added it to the stack for morning. Outside the barracks window, London was doing what London does at night, humming, glittering, moving forward, carrying its millions of small human stories inside its long streets and bright windows, each one unaware of all the others, each one complete in itself. And somewhere in the east wing of a very old palace, the corridors stood empty and still, holding within their stone walls the echo of a morning that had mattered more than anyone had planned.